A group of tourists on a quiet wilderness tour never expected their peaceful drive to take such a dramatic turn when a herd of wild Mustangs appeared out of nowhere and surrounded their bus. Panic set in, but what happened next left everyone in shock. This is a story of nature's power, human connection, and an encounter no one could have predicted. Before we dive and, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss more unforgettable stories like this one. Let's get started. It was a crisp autumn morning, and the bus rumbled down a narrow dirt road that cut through the heart of Nevada's vast wilderness. The air was cool and still, and the low hum of the engine blended with the occasional chirp of distant birds. Inside the bus, a group of 15 tourists chattered excitedly, their cameras dangling from their necks. Most were first-time visitors to the region, eager to catch a glimpse of the legendary wild Mustangs that roam these lands. Leading the tour was 48-year-old Jack Collins, a seasoned guide with a deep love for the untamed beauty of the American West. His weathered face carried the stories of countless adventures, and his voice, calm and steady, carried an air of authority. This is one of the last true havens for wild Mustangs, he said, addressing the group. If we're lucky, we might see a herd grazing near the river. The tourists leaned closer to the windows, their breath fogging the glass. As they scanned the horizon, the landscape stretched endlessly, a tapestry of golden grasses, jagged cliffs, and distant mountains, painted with hues of orange and pink from the rising sun. For most, this was a once-in-a-lifetime experience, a chance to witness nature in its rawest form. As the bus rounded a bend, the atmosphere shifted. Jack noticed at first the eerie silence that fell over the group, as if the wilderness itself was holding its breath. He slowed the bus's eyes narrowing as he scanned the terrain. Then in the distance, he saw them, a herd of Mustangs. At first they were just shadows on the horizon, their forms blurred by the morning haze. But as the bus crept closer, the details became clear. There were at least 20 of them, their powerful bodies gleaming in the sunlight. They stood in a tight formation, their heads high and their ears flicking toward the bus. The lead stallion of a striking black horse with a white blaze on its face stepped forward, his stance commanding and protective, while a woman in the front row whispered, breaking the silence. Cameras clicked and voices murmured in awe as the herd began to move. But instead of retreating, the Mustangs advanced, their movements synchronized and deliberate. Jack's grip on the steering wheel tightened. He had seen wild horses before, many times in fact, but never like this. They weren't grazing or running freely. They were surrounding the bus. What's happening? A man near the back asked, his voice tinged with nervousness. Are they going to charge? Jack shook his head, though his gut churned with unease. Stay calm, he said, his voice steady. They're probably just curious. But as the Mustangs closed and their intentions became harder to read, the lead stallion stopped a few feet from the bus, his dark eyes locking onto Jack's through the windshield. The other horses followed suit, encircling the vehicle until the bus was completely met, and the tourists leaned forward in their seats, their excitement giving way to tension. Why are they doing this? A young woman asked, her hands clutching the seat in front of her. Jack didn't have an answer, his heart pounded as he tried to decipher the stallion's behavior. Was it a warning, a display of dominance, or something else entirely? The bus engine idled, the low rumble filling the otherwise silent air. Jack's instincts told him to stay put, to wait and see what the horses would do, but the tourists were growing restless, their whispers rising in volume as fear began to creep in. Then something unexpected happened. The lead stallion pawed the ground, his powerful hoof striking the dirt with a force that sent a small cloud of dust into the air. The other horses mirrored his actions, their movements deliberate and rhythmic, almost like a dance. Jack's breath caught in his throat. He had seen Mustangs do incredible things run for miles across open plains, protect their young with fierce loyalty. But this was unlike anything he had ever witnessed. The herd wasn't just surrounding the bus, they were communicating. What are they trying to tell us? Jack murmured to himself, his eyes never leaving the stallion. The tourists fell silent again, their fear mingling with awe as they watched the strange scene unfold. The wilderness, once a distant and untouchable expanse, now felt alive, pulsing with a force none of them could explain. Jack didn't know it yet, but this moment was just the Beginning the Mustangs had a purpose, and their actions would soon reveal a story. That no one on the bus would ever forget the bus sat motionless on the dirt road, its engine rumbling softly as the herd of Mustangs maintained their tight circle around it. Jack Collins gripped the steering wheel, his sharp eyes flicking between the lead stallion and the rest of the herd. The black horse, with the white blaze, remained unyielding, his gaze locked on Jack, as if demanding his attention. The tourists inside the bus sat frozen, their excitement now replaced by a mix of fear and curiosity. Cameras dangled forgotten from necks, and whispers spread through the group like wildfire. "Why aren't they moving a man?" asked from the back. "Maybe they're just curious," offered someone else, though the uncertainty in their voice betrayed their unease. Jack held up a hand to quiet the murmurs. "Leighton, stay calm," he said, his voice low but firm. "Wild horses are highly intelligent. They don't do anything without a reason." But even as he spoke, his own unease grew. He had led countless tours through Mustang territory, and while he'd seen these animals display curiosity before, this behavior was different. It wasn't curiosity, it was intention. The lead stallion pawed at the ground again, his hoof striking with enough force to kick up a puff of dust. The rest of the herd mirrored his movements, their synchronized actions creating a strange, almost hypnotic rhythm. Jack's pulse quickened as he tried to make sense of it. "They're trying to tell us something," he muttered to himself. Beside the bus, a young chestnut wind, her high-pitched call piercing the still air. The sound sent a shiver down Jack's spine. It wasn't a casual sound. It was urgent, almost distressed. The tourists leaned closer to the windows, their breaths fogging the glass. As they watched the maze, "She looks upset," someone said quietly. Jack nodded, his mind racing. Wild horses communicated through subtle cues, body language, vocalizations, even the positioning of their ears. The mare's behavior, coupled with the stallion's commanding stance, painted a picture Jack couldn't ignore. Something was wrong. "Stay here," Jack said, standing abruptly. "What, you're going out there?" A woman in the front row asked, her voice rising with alarm. Jack grabbed his jacket from the back of his seat and pulled it on. "If they're acting like this, there's a reason. I need to figure out what it is." He stepped off the bus, the crunch of his boots on the dirt road breaking the heavy silence. The cold air stung his face, but he kept his movements slow and deliberate as he approached the lead stallion. The black horse didn't flinch. As Jack drew closer, his ears flicked forward, his body tense but steady. Jack raised his hands, palms out, in a gesture of peace. "It's all right," he said softly. "I'm just here to help." The stallion snorted, his breath visible in the cool morning air. He pawed the ground again, his hoof scraping the dirt in a way that almost seemed to point toward the trees. Jack followed his gaze, squinting into the dense forest that bordered the road. "What is it, boy?" Jack murmured, taking a step toward the trees. The stallion whined sharply, the sound cutting through the air like a warning. Jack froze, his heart pounding slowly. He turned back to the herd. The chestnut mare from earlier had moved closer to the bus, her ears pinned back and her movements agitated. "What's going on out there?" one of the tourists called from the bus. Jack didn't respond. His focus was entirely on the herd, now his instincts as a guide, an animal lover, taking over. He crouched low, his eyes scanning the ground for any clues. That's when he saw it, tracks, deep hoof prints mixed with skid marks in the dirt. LED away from the road and into the forest. The marks were erratic, as if an injured horse, or perhaps a group, had been dragged or struggled through the undergrowth. Jack's stomach tightened. He stood and turned to the lead stallion. "Is this what you're trying to show me?" he asked aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. The stallion snorted again, his dark eyes intense and unwavering. It was as if the horse understood his words. Jack's mind raced. Injured horses meant danger, predators, perhaps, or worse, whatever had happened in the woods. The Mustangs clearly wanted him to see it, but to leading the tourists into the unknown carried its own risks. He glanced back at the bus, where worried faces pressed against the windows. His gut told him that this wasn't just about the horses anymore. Whatever was in those woods might need saving, and he couldn't ignore it. Taking a deep breath, Jack turned to the group. "Stay, hear us," he called. "I'll be back soon." The tourists erupted into protest, but Jack didn't stop to listen. He adjusted his jacket, grabbed his flashlight from the side pocket and stepped into the forest, following the tracks that the Mustangs had so urgently pointed him toward. The stallion whined one last time, a sound that echoed in Jack's mind as he disappeared into the trees. The forest swallowed Jack whole as he stepped off the dirt road and into the dense undergrowth. The sunlight faded quickly under the canopy of towering pines, casting the woods in a dim greenish light. His boots crunched against the carpet of leaves and twigs, the sound eerily loud in the otherwise silent wilderness. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he followed the trail of tracks. The hoof prints were deep and irregular, as if the animal had been limping or dragging its weight. Beside them, faint streaks in the dirt suggested a struggle. His flashlight's beam cut through the shadows, illuminating every detail of the disturbed ground. What happened here? He murmured to himself. The air felt heavy, charged with an unspoken tension. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, though every time he glanced over his shoulder, the forest remained still. The distant whinny of the Mustangs echoed faintly from the road, a reminder of their strange, deliberate behavior. After several minutes, the tracks led Jack to a small clearing. He stopped at the edge, his breath catching as he took in the scene. Before him, lying in the middle of the clearing, was a young Mustang, a filly barely more than a year old. Her chestnut coat was streaked with mud and her body trembled with exhaustion. One of her hind legs was twisted unnaturally, and her shallow breaths were audible even from where Jack stood. The sight hit him like a punch to the gut. The filly was alive, but barely. She must have been separated from the herd during the struggle, and judging by the state of her injuries, she hadn't eaten or drunk water in days. Easy now, Jack said softly, stepping into the clearing with his hands raised. The filly's ears flicked weakly in his direction, but she didn't move. Her dark eyes filled with pain and fear watched him wearily. Jack crouched a few feet away, speaking in a low, soothing tone. "You're okay. I'm here to help." He scanned her body, noting the gash on her side and the swelling around her injured leg. The wounds weren't fresh, but they were untreated. An infection was setting in. She wouldn't survive much longer without help. Jack reached into his jacket and pulled out a water bottle. He poured some into his cued hand, extending it toward the filly. "Come on, girl." Just a little. The filly hesitated, her nostrils flaring as she sniffed the air slowly, cautiously. She stretched her neck and lapped at the water. Jack felt a surge of relief. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As she drank, Jack's mind raced. Getting her back to the bus would be a challenge, but leaving her here was a death sentence. The herd had clearly led him to her for a reason, and he couldn't ignore their call for help. "All right," he said, standing up. "Let's get you out of here." He pulled off his jacket and gently draped it over the filly's body to keep her warm. Then, using the flashlight, he scanned the area for anything he could use to transport her. The forest offered little in the way of resources, but Jack's eyes landed on a sturdy branch lying nearby. With some effort, he could fashion a makeshift sled to drag her back to the road. Jack worked quickly, cutting strips of fabric from his shirt to tie the branch together. The filly watched him with tired eyes, her breath slowing as she rested. When the sled was ready, Jack crouched beside her again, speaking softly. "This is going to hurt, but we need to move." He looped the fabric gently under her body, lifting her onto the sled. With as much care as could manage, the filly let out a weak whinny, her body trembling from the effort, but she didn't resist. Once she was secure, Jack grabbed the front of the sled and began to pull. The weight was heavier than he'd expected, and his muscles burned with every step. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly before him, the road feeling farther away with each passing minute. But Jack didn't stop. The filly's shallow breaths drove him forward, and the image of the herd standing protectively around the bus stayed with him. They had trusted him to save her, and he wouldn't let them down after what felt like an eternity. The road came into view. Jack's chest heaved with relief as he saw the bus still parked where he had left it. The tourists pressed their faces against the windows, their expressions a mix of shock and concern, as they spotted Jack emerging from the forest with the injured filly in tow. He staggered to the side of the bus, his voice hoarse as he called out, "Someone help me get her inside." The tourists sprang into action, opening the bus doors and rushing to his aid. Together, they lifted the filly onto the bus, settling her carefully on a blanket near the front. Jack collapsed into a seat, his body aching, but his heart steady. The Lead Stallion stood at the edge of the road, watching the scene unfold. His dark eyes met Jack's one last time before he turned and led the herd back into the wilderness. The bus rumbled back to life, its engine echoing through the quiet wilderness. As Jack settled into the driver's seat, the injured filly lay on a makeshift bed of blankets near the front, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. The tourists sat quietly, their earlier excitement replaced with somber concern as they watched Jack's every move. Is she going to make it? A woman asked softly from the second row, her hands clutching her camera as if it could somehow provide answers. Jack didn't look away from the road as he replied, "I don't know. She's weak, and the leg it's bad, but we're going to try." The lead stallion and the rest of the herd had disappeared into the forest, their mission seemingly complete now that the filly was in Jack's care, but their departure left an odd emptiness, as if the weight of responsibility now rested solely on Jack's shoulders. The road ahead was rough and winding, cutting through miles of untamed wilderness. Before reaching the nearest small town, Jack had already called ahead to a local veterinarian who promised to meet them at the clinic as soon as they arrived. But every bump in the road, every jolt of the bus felt like a race against time. "Keep her calm," Jack instructed one of the tourists, a middle-aged woman who had volunteered to sit near the filly. She gently stroked the filly's neck, murmuring soothing words, though her own face betrayed the fear she felt as the bus climbed a steep incline. The engine strained and Jack's knuckles tightened on the wheel. The dirt road had become uneven with patches of loose gravel, threatening to pull the vehicle off course. The added weight of the passengers and the filly only made the journey more precarious. Suddenly, a loud thud jolted the bus, followed by the sound of something scraping against the undercarriage. Jack slammed the brakes, the vehicle skidding to a halt on the narrow road. The tourists gasped, clutching their seats as the bus came to a stop just inches from the edge of a steep drop. "What was that?" someone asked, panic rising in their voice. Jack grabbed a flashlight and stepped out of the bus, the cold air biting at his skin. As he crouched to inspect the damage, his heart sank as he saw the problem. A large rock had lodged itself against the axle, causing the scraping sound. It wasn't catastrophic, but it would slow them down. As Jack worked to dislodge the rock, the sounds of the wilderness pressed in around him, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of a bird, the faint whisper of the wind. It all felt too quiet, too tense. Rosie's absence weighed on his mind. She would have been at his side, alerting him to danger. Finally, with a grunt of effort, Jack freed the rock and tossed it aside, but as he stood and dusted off his hands, a sound in the distance froze him in place. A low, guttural growl. His flashlight swept across the forest, the beam catching only shadows and trees. The growl came again, closer this time. Jack's pulse quickened as he scanned the area, his breath visible in the cold air. Mountain lions were rare in this region, but not unheard of. An injured filly would make easy prey, and the scent of her blood could draw predators from miles away. Jack climbed back onto the bus, shutting the door tightly behind him. "We need to move," he said, his voice firm but calm. "What's wrong?" one of the tourists asked, their eyes wide with fear. "Nothing yet," Jack replied, glancing at the filly, "but we're not safe here." The bus lurched forward, its engine groaning as it climbed the last stretch of the incline. Jack kept his eyes on the road, but his mind raced with plans. He couldn't afford another delay, not with the filly's life hanging in the balance. The minutes felt like hours as the bus wound its way down the other side of the mountain. The tourists whispered among themselves, their fear palpable in the enclosed space. The woman sitting beside the filly continued to stroke its neck, her quiet words a small comfort in the tense atmosphere. Finally, the lights of the small town appeared on the horizon, a beacon of hope against the darkening sky. Jack's chest tightened with relief, but he didn't let his guard down. The vet clinic was still several miles away, and the filly's condition was deteriorating with every passing moment. As they entered the town, Jack reached for his phone and called the veterinarian. "We're 5 minutes out," he said, his voice urgent. "Be ready when the bus pulled into the clinic's parking lot." The veterinarian and her assistant were already waiting with a stretcher. Jack jumped down from the driver's seat, his exhaustion forgotten, as he helped lift the filly onto the stretcher. The tourists watched from the windows, their faces pressed against the glass. "She's in bad shape," the vet said, her tone grave as She examined the filly, but you got her here. Just in time, Jack exhaled his hands. Resting on his knees as he caught his breath, the filly let out a faint whinny, her eyes half closed as the vet wheeled her into the clinic. For the first time since the herd had surrounded the bus, Jack felt a flicker of hope they had made it. Now it was up to the vet and the filly's will to survive the waiting room of the veterinary clinic was eerily quiet, the air heavy with tension. Jack sat on a worn-out bench, his elbows resting on his knees and his hands clasped tightly together, his body ached from the long journey, but his mind was too restless to notice the tourists were scattered around the room there earlier. Chatter replaced by a heavy silence as they waited for new news. A clock on the wall ticked steadily, its rhythmic sound amplifying the feeling of endless waiting. Jack's eyes drifted to the window where the fading sunlight cast long shadows across the small town. He thought of the herd, the lead stallion, the chestnut May, and the others who had led him to the injured filly. Their actions had been deliberate, almost as if they knew they couldn't save her on their own. Why, one of the tourists finally asked, breaking the silence. A middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair leaned forward, his expression a mix of confusion and awe. Why did the Mustangs pick us? Jack shook his head, his gaze still fixed on the window. Horses are smarter than people give them credit for. They knew she needed help, and they trusted us to do the right thing. The group fell silent again, his words hanging in the air. For the first time, they realized they had been part of something extraordinary, an unspoken bond between man and nature that defied explanation. The sound of footsteps broke the stillness, and everyone turned as the veterinarian entered the room. Her face was tired but hopeful, a small smile tugging at her lips. She's stable for now, the vet said, her voice calm. We cleaned her wounds, and the leg was fractured, but it's set now. She'll need time to heal, but she has a strong will to live. Relief washed over the room, the tension lifting like a heavy fog. A few of the tourists let out audible sighs, while others murmured words of gratitude. Jack simply nodded, his chest tightening with emotion. He had spent years guiding people through the wilderness, but this moment felt different, like something bigger than himself. Can we see her? A woman asked, her voice hesitant. The vet nodded, only a few at a time, and keep it quiet. She's still weak. Jack stood first, his boots scuffing against the floor as he followed the vet down the hall. The others stayed behind, giving him space. As he approached the filly's stall, the room was small but warm, the faint smell of antiseptic lingering in the air. The filly lay on a thick bed of straw, her injured leg wrapped in fresh bandages. Her chestnut coat, now clean, gleamed faintly under the soft light. Jack crouched beside her, his movements slow and deliberate. Hey there, girl, he murmured. The filly ears flicked at the sound of his voice, and she turned her head weakly to look at him. Her dark eyes, though tired, held a spark of recognition. You've got a lot of people rooting for you, Jack, said his voice soft but steady. He reached out his hand, brushing against her neck. The filly let out a faint whinny, her breath warm against his fingers. It was a small gesture, but it carried a world of meaning. For a few moments the world outside faded away. It was just Jack and the filly, two beings connected by an unspoken understanding. She had fought to survive, and he had fought to save her. Together they had beaten the odds. As Jack stood to leave, he glanced back one last time. The filly's eyes were half closed, her body finally at rest. You're going to be all right, he whispered, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Back in the waiting room, the tourist greeted him with hopeful expressions. How is she? Someone asked. Jack nodded, his voice filled with quiet pride. Check, a fighter. She'll pull through. The group shared a collective sense of relief, their bond stronger than ever after the harrowing journey. They had come to see wild Mustangs, but they had left with a story they would carry for the rest of their lives, a story of survival, resilience, and the unbreakable connection between humans and nature. That night, as Jack returned to his motel, he couldn't shake the feeling that the herd was still watching somewhere out there in the vast wilderness. The lead stallion stood tall, his dark eyes scanning the horizon. Jack didn't know if he would ever see them again, but he knew one thing for certain: they had placed their trust in him, and he hadn't let them down. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the veterinary clinic, bathing the small waiting room in a golden glow. The tourists who had spent the night in the nearby motel gathered once again, their expressions filled with hope and anticipation. Jack was already there leaning against the counter with a steaming cup of coffee in hand as eyes. Fixed on the hallway that led to the recovery stalls, the veterinarian, Dr. Emily Harper, emerged from the back. Her face calm but focused, she greeted the group with a small smile. The filly made it through the night. She said, her voice steady, her vitals are stable, and she's eating a little. That's a very good sign. A wave of relief washed over the room. The tourists exchanged smiles, their shared ordeal forming a bond that transcended their brief time together. For many of them, this was more than just a story to tell. It was an experience that had changed them. Jack sat down his coffee and approached Dr. Harper. What's next for her? He asked. Dr. Harper's expression softened. She'll need a lot of care. The leg will take weeks to heal, and she'll need regular checkups to make sure the infection doesn't return. But she's a strong one. I think she'll pull through. Jack nodded, his mind already racing with plans. He had connection with a Mustang sanctuary a few hours away, a place dedicated to rehabilitating and rehoming wild horses. If the filly recovered well enough, it could be her new home, a safe haven where she could roam free and one day rejoin her kind as the group was allowed to visit. The filly in pairs, Jack hung back, letting the others have their moment. He watched as the tourists approached her, stalled, their voices hushed as they marveled at the resilience of the young horse. Cameras clicked, capturing the tender moments of recovery. But this time the photos weren't just souvenirs, they were symbols of hope. One by one, the tourists returned to the waiting room, their expressions lighter than before. A young woman approached Jack, her camera hanging from her neck. I still can't believe it, she said, her voice filled with wonder. How they led us to her, how they knew. Jack nodded, his gaze distant. Mustangs are survivors. They look out for their own, and sometimes they trust us enough to ask for help. The woman smiled faintly. They chose the right person. Jack didn't respond, but her words stayed with him. He had spent most of his life guiding people through the wilderness, teaching them to respect and admire the untamed beauty of the land. But this was different. The herds trust had been a gift, one he would carry with him for the rest of his days. Later that afternoon, as Jack prepared to leave the clinic, Dr. Harper approached him with a clipboard. The sanctuary you mentioned, she said, handing him a form. I've been in touch with them. They're willing to take her once she's stable enough to travel. Jack took the clipboard, his heart lifting. Thank you. I'll make sure she gets there. Dr. Harper smiled. You've already done so much. It's rare to see someone go to these lengths for a wild horse. Jack shrugged, his expression humble. She deserves a chance. As he stepped outside, the crisp autumn air filled his lungs, carrying with it a sense of clarity. The tourists had already boarded the bus, their journey soon coming to an end. But for Jack, the road ahead felt like it was just beginning. Before climbing into the driver's seat, Jack paused in the distance beyond the town's edge. The wilderness stretched endlessly, its mysteries hidden among the rolling hills and dense forests. For a brief moment he imagined the herd, the lead stallion standing tall, his dark eyes scanning the horizon. Jack didn't know if he would ever see them again, but he felt their presence like a whisper on the wind. He turned back to the bus, his voice steady as he addressed the group. All right, folks, let's head back. As the bus rumbled down the road, the tourists chatted quietly, sharing their reflections on the experience. Some spoke of the filly's resilience, others of the herd's incredible intelligence. But for all of them, the encounter had been more than a chance meeting with wild mustangs. It had been a reminder of the delicate balance between humanity and nature. Jack's gaze flicked to the rearview mirror, where the small town faded into the distance. He didn't know what the future held for the filly, but he felt a quiet certainty that she would make it, and perhaps one day she would run free again. Weeks had passed since the dramatic rescue, and Jack found himself standing at the gates of the Mustang sanctuary. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the faint sound of hooves against the earth. In the distance, rolling hills stretched endlessly, dotted with grazing horses, their manes rippling in the wind. It was a place of peace and freedom, a far cry from the wilderness where the filly had been found. Jack leaned against the wooden fence, his eyes fixed on the young filly who now stood in the paddock before him. Her chestnut coat, once matted and dull, now shone in the sunlight, a testament to her resilience and the care she had received. Her injured leg was still bandaged, but she moved with a cautious confidence, her steps no longer Faltering Sheck come a long way, said CLA, the sanctuary's director, as she joined. Jack at the fencer tone was warm, her smile genuine. When she arrived, I wasn't. Sure she'd make it, but she's a fighter. Jack nodded his gaze, never leaving the filly she had a lot of. People rooting for her, and a herd that wouldn't give up. Claire chuckled softly. I've worked with Mustangs for years, but I've never heard a story like hers. It's almost as if the herd knew you'd help. Jack's lips curved into a faint smile. They didn't give me much of a choice as they stood in silence. The filly lifted her head, her dark eyes locking onto Jack. For a moment it was as if the world fell away, leaving only the two of them. She took a tentative step toward the fencer, ears flicking forward. Jack extended his hand, and she nuzzled it gently, her breath warm against the skin. You've got a good life ahead of you now, Jack murmured. You're safe. Here the sound of hooves drew Jack's attention. To the far side of the paddock, a group of Mustangs galloped gracefully across the field, their powerful bodies moving in perfect harmony. Among them was a black stallion with a white blaze of sight that sent a jolt through Jack's chest. It's him, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Claire followed his gaze. The lead stallion. Jack nodded, his eyes wide with disbelief. The stallion slowed as he neared the paddock, his ears flicking toward the filly. The rest of the herd followed their movements, fluid and deliberate. The filly let out a high-pitched whinny, her body trembling with excitement. As she watched them approach, Jack stepped back, giving her space. As she moved closer to the fence, the stallion stopped a few feet away, his dark eyes scanning the filly before turning to Jack. There was something in his gaze, recognition perhaps, or gratitude. Jack wasn't sure, but the weight of the moment pressed heavily on his chest. He came back for her, said softly, her voice tinged with wonder. The filly paced along the fence, her whinnies growing louder as the herd lingered nearby. Jack's heart ached at the sight. He had spent weeks ensuring her survival, but he knew she belonged with them, with her family. She's ready, Jack said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. Let her go. See, I hesitated. Are you sure she's still recovering? She's strong, Jack interrupted, his eyes never leaving the filly. Stronger than any of us gave her credit, for she belongs with them. CLA nodded, her expression somber but understanding. She opened the gate slowly, stepping aside as the filly hesitated for a moment before stepping through. The herd moved closer, the stallion letting out a deep resonant whinny as the filly trotted toward them. The moment she reached the group, they surrounded her, their movements protective and welcoming. Jack watched in silence as the herd turned and began to move, their forms growing smaller against the backdrop of the rolling hills. The filly glanced back once, her dark eyes meeting Jack's for a fleeting moment before she disappeared into the distance. She's home, Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack exhaled deeply, his chest tightening with a mix of pride and sorrow. Oh yeah, he said softly, she's home. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Jack leaned against the fence, a quiet smile on his face. The herd had trusted him to save one of their own, and he had delivered it. It was a story he would carry with him forever, a reminder of the unbreakable bond between humans and the wild, and the power of hope and compassion. As the herd disappeared into the horizon, Jack stood in silence, knowing he had done the right thing. The filly was back where she belonged, a powerful reminder of the connection between humans and the wild. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who loves inspiring tales of courage and compassion. Together, let's spread the message of hope and resilience.